Today is a very good day, in my opinion. Even the Lord has blessed us. Today, the sun was shining all day in Moscow, something very rare. I wouldn't know. I spent half the day at the shooting range, where it's always sunny. Yes, the sun was shining all day. To my surprise, the sun was shining. Well, we can safely say that the events that took place in Riyadh are very much a triumph of President Putin's foreign policy. He is a man of exceptional intelligence, strength of will, and sensibility. I'd like to congratulate us and all of Russia on such a president.
Najpopularniejszym tematem, intensywnie omawianym w rosyjskich mediach propagandowych są...
The most popular topic covered by the Russian propaganda media is the relationship between Russia and the United States. In recent days, the Russian media have intensely commented on the contacts between representatives of the two governments. First and foremost, propaganda commented on the talks in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, which were attended by representatives of the Russian and US delegations. The Russians were happy to point out that the talks took place in a positive atmosphere. The meeting was accompanied by jokes and various pleasant gestures from both delegations. It was indicated that an agreement on Ukraine, as well as on many other issues linking the US and Russia, was imminent. It was unequivocally noted that there has been a breakthrough in the US-Russian relations, with which Russia is very pleased. This was primarily linked to the fact that there has been a change in the White House, and new elites have come to power who have a very different attitude towards Russia than Biden's team. It was pointed out that they are not driven by prejudice and Russophobia, and are open to establishing pragmatic, rational relations with Russia. The propagandists who commented on these news reports were also in very good spirits. They expect a meeting between Putin and Donald Trump to take place in the near future, and perhaps many issues from the US-Russia relationship will be resolved in a positive outcome for Russia. And, above all, there will be an agreement in some form on the war in Ukraine that is favorable to Russia. We begin with an assessment of what was achieved on the part of the Russian president. On the other side of that table were different Americans.
Как мне сказали, наши участники это совсем с американской стороны были совсем другие.
As our participants told me, these were completely different people on the American side of the table who were open to the negotiation process, without any bias, without any judgment of what had been done in the past. In any case, there was nothing like that in the bilateral contacts, but were very open in terms of cooperation. Open to cooperation. It's a first in these talks. Hence, the first result of the process of unfreezing bilateral relations has begun. The assessment is high. I rate the talks highly. The result is, in my opinion, we have taken the first step towards resuming work on various fronts that involve common interests.
Widać tutaj, że Rosja oczekuje pokoju.
We see that Russia expects peace on its terms. The propaganda emphasized that Russia's conditions for a peace agreement had not changed, and, above all, Russia was keen to remove the root causes of the war. This position of Russia has not changed. It's worth pointing out here that in the Russian media there is an expectation, and such an expectation has been developed in past years by Kremlin propaganda, that Russia will be victorious. And it would be good from the point of view of the propagandists and probably the Kremlin itself for this victory to coincide with the celebration of the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II and the signing of the Yalta Agreements. Russia and the Kremlin dream of reclaiming Europe and of organizing such a second Yalta. We expect so much from Donald Trump. But look, if Trump is cracking down so hard on his false allies yesterday, you have to realize that he is a tough negotiator. If it comes to discussing the nuances of our national interests, he will not be nodding along. Our position has to be clear, understandable. We have to first build on our successes on the battlefield, on military issues, and on our economic achievements in all other areas. And there is no room for relaxing, no expectation that this is the end, that we have won.
Никакого ожидания, что вот все, мы победили. Вот нет.
The Russians are counting on the US to be willing to take Russia's arguments into account and accept its terms when it comes to the war in Ukraine. And as we know, Russia's primary aim is the capitulation of Ukraine. I would love to meet Donald Trump. However, we are in a situation where it is not enough to just meet, to have tea or coffee, to sit down and talk about the future. We need to get our teams to prepare issues that are extremely important for both the US and Russia. What is happening in Ukraine is a delicate topic. Trump is beginning to realize that things are more complex than he thought. There is no longer any question of rushing these things. When Mr. Trump was a candidate for President of the United States, he talked about deadlines, a fairly short time frame for solving the Ukraine crisis. But after he started receiving information, already as President of the United States, from intelligence agencies and so on, he changed his position. He admitted that it would take 6 months. Well, now is not the time to talk about deadlines. And the representatives of the European Union are in bad terms with both Putin and Trump. All European leaders, all without exception, have been directly involved in the US election process. They even went so far as to directly insult one of the candidates. For our part, while it was of course clear who we were sympathetic to, we did not allow ourselves to interfere, let alone make any harsh statements or insulting remarks about any of the candidates. We simply didn't do it, and the Europeans did. Besides, Putin sees in Trump the characteristics that he himself has. Frankly, I'll admit that I'm a little in awe of the restraint of the newly elected President Trump towards his allies who behaved, let's be honest, in a boorish manner.
W przekazach propagandowych krytykowano Europę, wskazywano...
Propaganda messaging criticized Europe, pointing out that, against the backdrop of an emerging agreement between Russia and the US, the understanding and alliance between the United States and Europe was crumbling and breaking down. The transatlantic community is becoming a thing of the past. Let us add here that it's Russia's long-term goal to dismantle the international structures that unite the United States and Europe. Russian propaganda indicates that against the backdrop of renewed contacts between Washington and Moscow, Europe is panicking. European leaders are seeking to somehow offer Ukraine any security guarantees and push their way into peace talks, which Russian propaganda points out, with satisfaction, are taking place without European participation, as well as bypassing Ukraine. In Europe, there is, however, a party of war led by the leaders of France and the United Kingdom, Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer. Both have already tied themselves to the regime in Kyiv by taking on incomprehensible commitments. They have made their political careers dependent on it, and they are flying to Washington next week to meet with Trump. They want to persuade him to give his blessing to send a 30,000 military contingent from Europe to Ukraine, but with mandatory security guarantees for Ukraine from the US. Trump knows that this is unacceptable for Russia. Trump himself has no obligations to the Kyiv regime. He is certainly free of them. But Kyiv has a different financial problem. Trump is a pragmatist, and he certainly knows how to count.
Powodem, dla którego w świetle rosyjskiej propagandy
The reason why, in the light of Russian propaganda, Ukraine, in the person of President Zelensky, is not at the table, is that the President of the United States of America, Donald Trump, has finally seen through him and become convinced that Vladimir Zelensky is not the legitimate president of Ukraine, but is in fact a dictator. These ideas, which had long been repeated by Russian propaganda, found their way into the president's statements, which of course was met with euphoric approval in Russian propaganda. It was pointed out that Trump, after he became president, began to be briefed by US services which provided him with reliable and credible information about who President Zelensky was and what the real reason of the war in Ukraine was. Let us add here that Russia, of course, maintains that it did not invade Ukraine, and that in fact Ukraine, by its provocative behavior, and Western Europe, not the United States, made this war inevitable. The US gave $350 billion to Ukraine. But where is this money? Where is it going? I have not seen any accounting. And then Trump was shown documents about the Ukrainian government's transactions in virtual currency. It was a way to move funds overseas. It became clear who was impressed by Oreshnik. It was Donald Trump. He understood everything. To say that the Russians could actually demolish all the cities, but they don't do it because they don't want to, shows that he has been properly briefed by intelligence. But the Germans don't understand this. Therefore, if Germans and the French think that this war will be a conventional one, it means they do not at all understand our doctrine. We're not playing around. First, we will wipe them off the face of the earth. If they're saying, no, you can't do this, it's not a first. Europe should by now be used to the fact that for every stupid thing they do, sooner or later, the boot of the Russian soldier will echo across their cobblestones. Only this time, we will not repeat the mistakes of Soviet times. We will not leave. Europe is incapable of curing itself from the inherent disease of Nazism. We will have doctors who will take regular and timely preventive measures.
Żeby nie było, że wszystko w rosyjskiej narracji jest optymistyczne i różowe, to są...
Not everything in the Russian narrative is optimistic and rosy. There are also issues that cause propagandists to grind their teeth. First and foremost is the idea, discussed in Europe, of sending a peacekeeping mission to Ukraine in some form, which would be a security guarantee for Ukraine, should any peace agreements be signed. We can see here that both Russian propagandists and the Kremlin firmly rule out and oppose such a possibility, and that this idea irritates the propagandists. In response to this, the experts in the studio tried to prove that Europe is not capable of generating and sustaining such a mission, especially without the support of the United States. It's also not capable of doing so for financial reasons, as well as the fact that European societies will not be ready for such a risk and expense. On the other hand, it was pointed out that if such a peacekeeping mission were to take place, Russia would not leave it unanswered. Solovyov is very radical on this subject, claiming that all participants of such a peace mission would be immediately exterminated by Russia. So curb your arrogance, keep calm. You want to send 30,000 to Russia? To Macron and Starmer, I will repeat the words that have been said many times in this studio, as a quote from a very accurate statement by the Duma member, Mr. Tolstoy. We will kill you all, anyone who steps on our soil. And we don't care what quality you're trying to conceive. We've said loud and clear that NATO troops, under any flag, under any excuse, without discussion, will be wiped out. We will kill you all, whoever comes to us with evil intentions, and we will save your nations from the Nazi plague. Even if you like this disease, we will cure you by force.
Даже если вам нравится это заболевание, мы излечим вас насильственными методами.
Because we know everything about you, and we understand everything, while clearly you cannot understand anything.
W rosyjskiej propagandzie, jeśli chodzi o Zelenskiego,
In Russian propaganda, there were reports that Trump had finally opened his eyes when it comes to Zelensky. And propagandists even allowed themselves to make jokes that perhaps Trump is just watching Russian propaganda, and that's where he gets his knowledge on what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening in Europe. Solovyov joked that he's probably watching Evening with Vladimir Solovyov, or maybe even Sunday Evening with Vladimir Solovyov. Here we see that the Russians have noticed and taken great delight in the fact that the statements Trump is making against Zelensky are indeed in line with what Russian propaganda has been saying for a long time, especially with regard to the allegations against Zelensky, that he lacks legitimacy as president in view of the fact that no presidential elections were held in Ukraine. This had been Russia's talking point for a while, and it's in stark contrast to the fact that, under the Russian constitution, it's Putin who should not be titled president, because the last presidential election in Russia was, in principle, held illegally. This claim is rejected by Russia, and at the same time, Russia is pushing its ideas that it is Zelensky who lacks legitimacy. And we see here that this has been pushed consistently, even though it is completely divorced from reality. It has, however, broken through into the mainstream and is finding its way into the American media and into public opinion.
Когда Трамп вдруг начинает говорить,
Suddenly, when Trump speaks, you guys start shouting that he is repeating Russian propaganda talking points. I really like the cartoon that has now been circulating where Trump is watching Evening with Solovyov. Well, it's just jokes, of course. Of course, the one he watches is actually Sunday Evening with Solovyov.
Конечно, это не так. Он смотрит «Воскресный вечер». Но если уж говорить совсем серьезно, то Трамп всего лишь говорит правду.
But in all seriousness, he's just telling the truth. And of course, you see how now Trump started to understand us. After he confronted Zelensky at the negotiations and saw that Zelensky was lying, constantly lying, all the time lying. After that, Trump understood what happened in Istanbul and how those 3 years and before, starting from the Paris meeting, I mean, now Trump understands us very well. Zelensky simply cannot be trusted. He lies all the time.
Зеленскому просто верить нельзя. Он все время врет.
Ciekawym momentem w rosyjskiej narracji jest to, że w programie
An interesting moment in the Russian narrative is that in the News of the Week program with Dmitry Kiselyov, the presenter came to the conclusion that basically, at this point, from Russia's point of view, it would be better if President Zelensky, despite being weak and lacking legitimacy, stayed in his position, because this gives hope that Ukraine will degrade as a state, that there will be various processes of disintegration, and that this is beneficial for Russia. And this vision of holding elections in a time of war and some person coming to power who would be connected to the United States and subordinated to its decisions, this scenario would not be very favorable for Russia. Therefore, we can see that as far as Zelensky is concerned, there has been a change of narrative here, and the Russians have thought to themselves that such a weak Ukrainian president in this position, causing some tension and generating further disintegration in the country, will be beneficial for Russia. Let's now turn to Zelensky's thesis that it suits Putin to get rid of him now. Maybe Trump is actually interested in putting his man in office as president, who would be completely subservient to the United States. This way, he could conserve the internal status quo in Ukraine, preserving the regime itself and using it in his own interests as a colony. Trump is certainly not driven by any emotions, only by cold calculations. In the past few days alone, much has been said about rare earths. Russia does not need such a turnaround. True, it is in our interest to keep Zelensky in office for as long as possible, until the regime is completely compromised and degenerated. It is with Zelensky that Ukraine needs to grow to start a new life. This is not about personality. It is with Zelensky that it will develop to do so, and as a result, it will eventually come to bloom, when all this Bandera scum will simply rot.
zobaczymy, jak będzie rozwijała się ta linia narracyjna. Nie wiadomo,
We'll see how this narrative line will develop. It remains to be seen whether it is really the Russians who think this way and will pursue it, or whether this is a propaganda game with some kind of hidden agenda. We have seen such contradictory statements more than once in the Kremlin propaganda. Finally, it's worth noting that the rhetoric of the propagandists on TV is still combative. Apart from the fact that they threaten to abolish the European mission if one appears on Ukrainian soil, we can see here that when it comes to Russia's rearmament, to the expansion of military power, basically all propagandists agree that Russia should continue this effort, pointing out that times are difficult and there is likely to be more chaos in Europe.
Несколько слов хочу сказать о самой такой горячей теме, которая обсуждалась всю прошлую неделю. Это
I just want to say a few words about the hottest topic that was discussed last week. It is about sending European troops to Ukraine. We will never agree to the presence of any troops, any NATO troops in any form. Analyzing this from a purely military point of view, Starmer will reportedly go on Monday to convince Trump that the Europeans are ready to send 30,000 people who will supposedly provide security guarantees.
готовы послать 30 тысяч человек, которые якобы обеспечат гарантии безопасности.
How they want to achieve this is also not clear, and the conclusion that Bloomberg draws is that, of course, at the end of the decade, Russia, after the special military operation, giving the rate at which Russian industry is growing, another year or two, and Russia will have rebuilt all its reserves, regained its capabilities, and will inevitably invade some NATO country at the end of the decade. Why? to simply see how the Americans will react, whether they will intervene or not.
Свои, так сказать, возможности, и к концу десятилетия обязательно на какую-нибудь страну НАТО нападет. Зачем? А вот просто посмотреть, как будут себя вести американцы. Вмешаются или не вмешаются.
Russia will just take and swallow the Baltic states and wait for what the Europeans do. In principle, I don't think that's such a bad idea, especially given the utterly boorish and insolent behavior of these Baltic tigers.
Совершенно хамского и наглого поведения вот этих балтийских тигров в отношении...
They are, after all, ready to fight against Russia. Estonia has stated that even if everyone refuses, it will go to fight Russia. Estonia will give military aid, soldiers, equipment, whatever.
Военнослужащими, техникой, чем угодно. Ну,
Не, эстонцы молодцы, все двое.
The Estonians are fine soldiers, all two of them. One drummer, they will all throw themselves into the fight. They will drum, drum, drum. It's just important that they don't get their directions mixed up, because suddenly they'll find themselves in Finland by accident. Yes, they will. They will take their battalion and go forward. No, they don't even have a battalion. No, they have a battalion. Well, on paper they might have. A small battalion, a teeny tiny battalion.
Поэтому все эти разговоры вот о посылке европейских войск, я думаю, это полный пшик.
That's why I say that all the talk of sending European troops is a load of rubbish. I don't underestimate Europe's capabilities either, if Europe mobilizes all its potential, yes. But again, Bloomberg writes correctly. The special military operation will end, and these Europeans, since the point is that all the funding is at the expense, so to speak, of social programs, will they be prepared to arm themselves and prepare for war with Russia? Bloomberg seriously doubts that.
Jeden z propagandystów twierdzi, że właśnie rosyjskie
One of the
pojazdy
propagandists claims that Russian combat vehicles should be on standby because the military factor is gaining ground. We can see that the propagandists have no good intentions whatsoever and are ready to continue the so-called Russian special military operation in Ukraine, aiming to subjugate the country and also expand their sphere of influence in Europe. And this is openly stated not only by the propagandists, but also by the Kremlin itself.
nie tylko propagandyści, ale i również sam Kreml.
Наш военный потенциал, устанавливать военные программы.
Reducing our military capabilities, stopping military programs, carrying out some kind of massive reduction of our security forces, that would be very short-sighted politically, if only because this new world will create what we can call the wilderness, including around our borders in economically important regions.
Называется дикое поле, в том числе вокруг наших границ, в том числе и в важных для нас.
How do we go about taming this wilderness? By sending in humanitarian organizations? And Trump's victory in this fight is by no means guaranteed yet, so we need to keep our armored trains on track. And we'd better have 3 such trains.
Поэтому наш бронепоезд надо держать на запасном пути. А лучше...
Более скажу, они сейчас, вот тот факт,
They, the soldiers, are now the most important, foundational factor on which all future peace depends. What matters now is that there is only one army in the world. One. The other one is about to be crushed. Only one that is able to live in the trenches in winter. Only one that is prepared to sacrifice and win. They have understood this, both overseas and in Europe, in various different corners of the world. The entire game now is played based on this fact. This is an army that is stronger than everyone else, that will fight to the end and will not allow anyone to attack Russia.
и который будет стоять до конца и не даст никому на Россию покуситься.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this, why not take a look at our other stories on screen now? And don't forget to subscribe.